This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 10 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, March 11th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts off with the Westford Center section. Friday evening, the pupils and teachers of the academy gave a dancing party at the town hall. The attendance was not such as to overcrowd the hall, and this made the dancing most enjoyable, and those in charge cleared expenses and felt that everyone had a good time. Thayer's Orchestra of Pepperell furnished excellent music, and ice cream and cake was served at intermission in charge of George E. Gould. Among our young people teaching in other towns who were present were Miss Edna Ferguson, Miss Edith Bicknell, and Archie Hartford. The matrons were Mrs. Alfred Hartford, Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher, and Mrs. Frank W. Bannister. And the young ladies who had charge of arrangements were Mrs. Ruth Flagg, Rachel Wall, and Lena Clement. The ladies of the Unitarian Society have recently installed a fine new range in their church kitchen. This is now what we call the First Parish Church United on Main Street. This, with the town water that was added a short time ago, are much appreciated improvements. Our readers of the column this week will miss the items of the genial contributor who writes under About Town. Mr. Samuel L. Taylor has had a serious attack of bronchitis with threatened pneumonia, but at this writing is gaining and beginning to sit up. His many friends wish him a speedy return to normal health. A real estate transaction reported this week is that Fred Shorey at the south part of the town has sold his place to Conant and Company of Littleton, and the expectation is that the Goldsmith Conant family will live on the place. Goldsmith in this usage is as a given name, not as an occupation. Goldsmith Conant. Miss M. Eudora Jones of Lunenburg was a guest for several days at the Congregational Parsonage last week. Henry O. Keyes of North Westford had 2 horses stolen from his barn Tuesday of this week. He thinks he traced the animals as far as the so-called Ed Richardson place on the road to Lowell, but lost track of them there. He notified Constable Boynton, who has been trying to help locate them. The state police have been notified, and every effort is being made to locate the animals. Mrs. Caroline Atwood fell Sunday at her home and is suffering with a broken hip. Mrs. Atwood is over 91 years old, and at her advanced age, this is a serious accident. She fell as she was walking across the room, and the accident happened. Dr. Wells and a trained nurse and her 3 devoted daughters are doing all they can to make their aged patient as comfortable as possible. Aside from deafness, and for one of her years, Mrs. Atwood has enjoyed quite comfortable health until this accident. Mrs. Atwood and her 3 daughters lived at 4 Graniteville Road, not far from the top of the road at Main Street. Mrs. Fred L. Snow of North Westford is convalescing from a serious surgical operation, and she has gone to visit her married daughter at Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks. The last meeting of the Board of Registrars will be held at the Town Hall this Saturday from 12 noon until 10 p.m. Reverend David Wallace, Charles O. Prescott, Otis Day, and the teachers at the Academy and a number of the students went to Lowell Thursday evening to hear William Jennings Bryan give his lecture on universal peace. The next section is called Caucuses. The Republicans of Westford held a very peaceful caucus Monday evening. It was called to order by Alfred W. Hartford, Secretary of the Town Committee. And I believe he was also the local rep to the State House at this time. Sherman H. Fletcher was chosen chairman and Alfred Hartford clerk. No opposition to renomination of present incumbents of the various offices developed till tree warden was reached, where it became necessary to open a marking list and use the checklist. Donald J. MacLeod received 19 marks against Harry L. Nesmith's 28. Candidates for constable appeared to rival hen's teeth in number. The nominee who was present objected to serving, but was persuaded to allow the use of his name. The absent nominee afterward refused to serve. Following the list of nominees, Sherman H. Fletcher, selectman. Following is the list of nominees: Sherman H. Fletcher, selectman for 3 years; J.W. Fletcher, assessor for 3 years; A.R. Schote, overseer of the poor for 3 years; Harwood L. Wright, treasurer; Leonard W. Wheeler, collector of taxes; William R. Taylor, auditor; Edson G. Boynton, constable; John A. Healy, constable; John Spinner, school committee, 3 years; Fred E. Reed, school committee, 3 years; E. H. Bailey, trustee of public library, 3 years; Harry L. Nesmith, tree warden. The Democrats held their caucus Tuesday evening with net results the same as the Republican caucus, with the following exceptions. Donald J. MacLeod was nominated for tree warden and John Sullivan for constable in place of John A. Healy. The next paragraph is titled Critically Ill. Samuel Alfred Taylor, who makes his home with Mr. and Mrs. Frank C. Wright when in town, was taken sick last week Friday and continued to suffer greatly. Early Tuesday morning, Dr. Martin of Lowell consulted with Dr. Blaney, who was attending the young man, and later in the day he was removed to the Lowell General Hospital, and Wednesday morning an operation for appendicitis was performed. The case proved a very grave one, and at this writing he is very seriously sick, and the physicians give but little hope of his recovery. His brother Albert from Boston was summoned when it was found he was seriously sick and has done all possible to help his brother. The next section is the Tadmuck Club section. The meeting of the Tadmuck Club, held in the Unitarian Vestry Tuesday afternoon, was most successful and enjoyable. There was a large number present of members and guests. Miss Ellen H. Kimball of Worcester was the speaker of the afternoon and lectured on, quote, the power of good reading, end quote. Miss Kimball fully merited the close and appreciative attention given her, for she is a capable and pleasing speaker, and her treatment of her subject was rich in suggestions as to how, the what, and the way in the gentle art of good reading. Many of the members expressed the hope that they might have Miss Kimball again address the club. At the close of the address, a club tea was served in charge of Miss Ella F. Hildreth, Mrs. Joseph Knight, and Mrs. John Feeney. The next meeting on March 21st will be a continuation of the season's special study of Spanish North America and will be the Panama Canal, in charge of Mrs. Benjamin H. Bailey. She's the wife of the pastor of the Unitarian Church. It was pleasant to have among the guests Tuesday afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Waldo E. Conant and Mrs. Grace E. Lawrence of Littleton. The next paragraph is entitled Wedding. Miss Bertha Amelia Prescott and William Henry Benjamin Jr. were married in Westford Tuesday by Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey. The newly married couple went the same day to their new home in West Somerville, which they had completely fitted up, ready for occupancy. The bride wore a most becoming traveling suit and was attended by members of her immediate family. She has always lived in Westford until within a few years, during which she has been engaged in trained nursing and takes with her from her many friends her many sincere good wishes for happiness and prosperity. The next section is on the Westford Grange. There was a good attendance at the last meeting of the Grange and much to occupy the attention of the patrons. Applications from 21 candidates for membership have been received for the spring initiations, and the regular officers and the ladies' third-degree staff are preparing for the conferring of these 4 degrees. Westford Grange sent a contribution of $5 to Wilmington Grange toward their building fund for a new hall. The entertainment for the evening was in charge of the 3 Graces, Pomona, Ceres, and Flora. These are officers of the local Grange. personated by Mrs. Daisy Colburn, Mrs. Ruth Benoit, and Miss Addie Day. J. Henry Colburn gave phonograph selections. Edson G. Boynton sang most acceptably, and Mrs. Pearlie E. Wright gave several recitations that were much enjoyed, after which an old-fashioned spelling bee was arranged. This went very well until the word daguerreotype sent many to their seats. To Leonard W. Wheeler went the credit of outspelling the rest. A good time is promised for the next meeting, March 16th. Mrs. Edson G. Boynton and Mrs. Leonard Wheeler are preparing a peddler's parade in which about 25 will take part, and the Grange Orchestra will assist with the musical part of the program. It is hoped all the Grangers will come and enjoy a good laugh and bring their pennies and small change and patronize these enterprising peddlers who will sell their wares for very nominal charges. A number of members from this Grange attended the sessions of the North Middlesex Pomona at Lowell the following day, at which there was a very large attendance and fine program. Among topics discussed was, what legislation should farmers make special effort to support? Howard W. Foster, chairman of the Committee on Institutes, DeLacy Corkum, and George P. Greenwood were the speakers. Also, does higher education make better housewives? Was ably discussed, and in addition, an excellent miscellaneous program. The Chelmsford Grange provided the dinner. Next, we have the Graniteville section. At 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, Mass was celebrated in Healy's Hall by Reverend Patrick Phelan, OMI. That's Oblates of Mary Immaculate, I believe, of Tewksbury. He preached an eloquent sermon taken from the words, "What profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his immortal soul?" Which can be found in both Matthew 16:26 and Mark 8:36. Father Phelan's words were followed with deep interest, and his remarks made a great impression on the large congregation present. Court Westford MCOF, that's the Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters, held an open meeting in Abbott's Hall, Ford's Village, on Sunday afternoon that was largely attended. The meeting was called to order by Albert R. Wall, who presented as the first speaker Cornelius F. Bulkley, a member of St. Augustine's Court of Boston. He was followed by Daniel H. McGuire of Haverhill. During the afternoon, a short musical program was given. Joe Wall, who has been confined to his home by illness for the past few days, is now feeling much improved. The Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church met at the home of Mrs. George D. Gilson on Thursday afternoon, March 9th. The members of the Albert R. Choate Hose Company held their regular meeting in Healy's Hall on Monday night. 3 new candidates were admitted into membership. The Westford Board of Registrars met in Healy's Hall on Monday evening, and several new names were added to the voting list. The next paragraph is entitled, Well Attended. The Union Temperance Service that was held in the Methodist Episcopal Church on Sunday evening was well attended, many being present from Westford and Ford's Village and immediate vicinity. Prayer was given by the pastor, Reverend Lewis F. Havermel, and the sermon preached by Reverend Mr. David Wallace of the Congregational Church in Westford. Mr. Wallace held the close attention of the large audience and handled the temperance question in a manner that left nothing to be desired. A pleasing feature in connection with the service was the singing of the male quartet, composed of Henry Smith, Edson Boynton, Reverend Lewis Havermel, and Oscar Nelson, who sang 2 selections in an effective manner. The whole service was given for the cause of temperance, and it is thought that much good will result from it. The last section is the Ford's Village section. The many friends of Mrs. James Wilson will be pained to hear of her illness at her home in Pleasant Street. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met in Recreation Hall on Wednesday afternoon. A dainty a dainty collation was served after the meeting. Recreation Hall was located in St. Andrew's Mission building. James Burns is visiting with friends in New York. Among the guests at the birthday celebration of Mrs. Arthur Blodgett of Westford, there were present from this village Mrs. William Weaver and grandson, Elmer de Roan, Mrs. Polly de Roan and William de Roan, Miss Marion Blodgett and Mr. and Mrs. William Baker and family. St. Catherine's Church Choir held a very successful rehearsal at the home of its director, Miss Mary F. Hanley, on Wednesday evening. Miss Priscilla Bennett has returned from a visit to her sister, Mrs. August Myers of Boston. That's the news in Westford for the week ending March 11th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.